meeting of the Planning Commission and City Council to talk about the wonderful world of code updates. So this is our final process for our code updates before we move on to the public hearing process for the implementation of our housing production strategy code amendment process for phase 1 of many. Just as a quick reminder, this is an 8-year process to implement the city's housing production strategy. This is the first chunk of updates that we are working on to implement a number of the action items associated with that housing production strategy. And so we have been working on this, as you all know, and have been updated on for the last year and a half or so. And we have been doing that with a grant through the Department of Land Conservation and Development and with the help of our consultants with MIG, who is here this afternoon to walk us through what we have done so far. And so what's being presented to you today is sort of the final package. It's a mix of new and of the old roundup of everything. What is new is incredibly dry and incredibly simple, and just sort of some final taking care of some inconsistencies of the code and just sort of wrapping things up in a nice bow. And then what is old is just sort of going through the final of this is what has been worked on over the last year and a half. This is what is final and proposed. And this is what has gone through the project advisory committee and what was presented yesterday to them and given the thumbs up to move forward with. So with that, I'm going to talk as little as possible so that I don't hack up a lung in front of you all because I'm a bit sick. But I am going to turn it over to Darcy and Brandon. They're going to walk you through everything. Obviously, I'm here to also interject and answer questions along the way. But the goal at the end of this is just to sort of get everybody's final buy-in and approval before we move on to the public hearing stage, which is planned for May and June over the next couple months. So with that, I will turn it over to Brandon and Darcy.
Thank you all, and hope you're feeling a little bit better, Kelly. Yeah, so we'll take it from here. Just reintroduce myself. Hi, everybody. I'm Brandon Crawford. I'm the lead planner on the consulting team with MIG, and I'm here with Darcy Radzinski, also with MIG. She's the project manager. So I will be taking us through this presentation here today. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. And you all seeing that all right? You should be seeing the presentation, seeing head nods. Yep. So yes, should be good. Okay, so this is our third Planning Commission and City Council joint work session briefing for this project. So I'll just kind of reiterate the agenda here real quickly that Kelly already mentioned. So just give a quick update on the overall status and timeline of the project. We're kind of here on the home stretch. We'll quickly summarize the amendments from package 1 amendments. So that's what we really focused on back in December. And as Kelly mentioned, this is kind of a lot of the package 1 and package 2 amendments are pretty dry, kind of just cleaning up inconsistencies in the code and making sure everything is in order. And then we'll move on and quickly summarize the key updates and provide a little bit of discussion and Q&A for all the key updates that we've covered throughout this project. And most of this should be pretty familiar to you all by now. And we'll again quickly go over some of the package 2 amendments, kind of blend in with the package 1, but most of this is just cleanup stuff. And we'll give a quick update on what we heard from the project advisory committee at the 4th advisory committee meeting that was held yesterday. We didn't have a whole lot of time between that meeting and this meeting, so we'll just quickly summarize what we heard from them yesterday, and then we'll talk about next steps, the project overall. So quick project update and status. So as Kelly mentioned, we put together a final code update memo, which really just summarizes the key updates and where you can find those key updates in your packet materials. And it kind of tracks when we initially discussed this with the project advisory committee and you all. And we revised the package one code amendments that we worked on back in December. And those revisions were really based on what we heard from the project advisory committee back in January. And then we drafted package two amendments. That was mostly took place in January and February. That's part of all of these materials are in your attachments to the package, to the whole meeting package. So package one is attachment A, package two is attachment B, and then attachment C is the final kind of adoption ready code amendments. It's everything is combined together, and it's just how it would look as the city would adopt it. So keep moving along here. So just a quick update on the overall schedule and timeline. As Kelly mentioned, been working on this for a little over a year now. Our involvement, MIG's involvement, really kicked off back in last March of 2024. So we've been working on this for about a year. We're here at the final City Council Planning Commission briefing that was scoped as a part of this project. And after today, we'll be moving into the official adoption process that will take place in April and in May. So I guess before I jump into the actual key updates, does anybody have any questions or comments on the general status or timeline? If not, can keep moving along. All right, hearing none, I think I'll just keep chugging along here. So key update one was to allow and enable small lot single family homes. So the key code modifications and amendments that we recommended were to allow this housing type just outright in the medium density and the high density zones. And I'll also note that we noted here in the presentation and in your packet materials where you can find these specific amendments in the attachment C, which again is that kind of combined package. So you can find that on page C1. We recommended that the minimum lot size for small lot single family be 2,500 square feet. And we revised certain dimension and development standards to help just ensure that the single family homes that are built on these lots remain fairly small, just to help with the overall affordability, particularly for first time home buyers. We recommended a minimum off-street parking for 2 spaces per dwelling unit, and we also provided a new definition for small lot single family. So as you probably know, this kind of flowed from the housing production strategy recommendations, and this was specifically implementing action 1.1, which was to encourage smaller single family detached houses. So this was addressed in the first draft of code amendments that was provided to the project advisory committee back in October, and it was shared with you all at our second city council work session briefing last fall. And we addressed it at the second PAC meeting also in October. And really, we haven't made very many revisions since our initial draft. The only major revision was to require two off-street parking spaces instead of one. Other than that, it's all everything you see is the same recommendations that we initially drafted. So I can pause there, see if there's any questions, comments on small lot single family. If
Not
not,
seeing any.
all right, I'll keep moving. So the key update number 2 was cottage clusters. So quite a bit of discussion on this item. So key updates we provided here was to allow cottage clusters outright through an administrative review process in all the residential zones. So that affects several areas of the code. Also to reduce the minimum lot size down to 7,000 square feet. I think the current one was 10 or 15,000 square feet. We also added some model code standards, specifically around design and open space and parking configuration. So we included a whole new section for that. And those model code standards are based on state model code. And we provided minimum off-street parking requirements and added a new definition for cottage clusters. And that definition is also based on the state's official definition for cottage clusters. So similar to most of these other key updates, this is based on or implementing HPS Action 1.2 to promote cottage cluster housing. This was also addressed in the initial batch of code update recommendations that were provided back in fall. So it's the same package of updates that was addressed in for the small lot single family. And some of the key input that we had received from the project advisory committee and you all as well was to increase the minimum off-street parking requirement per unit. Our initial recommendation was one off-street space per unit, which is what the state requirement is for large cities. However, Lebanon hasn't met the threshold of large cities yet. So you have a little bit more flexibility there. So we increase that off-street parking requirement to 2 spaces per unit, or 1 space per unit for units that have 1 bedroom or less. And that was one of the recommendations from some of the PAC members to kind of vary it by bedroom size or number of bedrooms. And then another key recommendation from the PAC was to limit the unit size to 900 total square feet. And that was really just to help ensure that, these units are more affordable and approachable for the residents. So that really sums it up for cottage clusters. Again, I'll pause and see if folks have questions or comments here on this item.
I'm good.
All right. Keep moving forward then. If anybody wants to go back at any point, we can probably flip through. So this one was pretty simple and straightforward. This was to remove the city's residential infill standards. Our overall recommendation was just to remove them altogether rather than updating them. So the HPS implementation action was to simplify those standards. And ultimately what we found was the best way to simplify residential infill was just to remove this kind of extra layer of regulation that would apply to infill and just apply the standard zoning standards that already apply to all housing. So again, this was also addressed in the first draft of code amendments back in fall and didn't really have any concerns from the project advisory committee, there was a little discussion around it, but ultimately everybody agreed with our initial recommendation just to remove it. So got full PAC support there. And yeah, so everything you see is what we initially recommended back in the fall. So any comments or questions on this item? All right, hearing none, I will move
I'd
on.
just like to say you
sure.
have an easy crowd today, Brandon.
No complaints from me.
Just to make you feel better, I have a feeling that they're soaking all this information in and you will have questions.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll have plenty of opportunities here for more questions.
I've seen this about a half dozen times.
All right. So next key update number 4. Again, another one that should look familiar to most of you at least, was updates for manufactured dwelling parks and manufactured homes. So this was mostly to ensure the city is consistent with state statute for these housing types. So I'll just quickly run through these. That included making updates to allow manufactured dwelling parks through an administrative review process rather than a conditional use process. And that's really intended to ensure that the city is complying with state requirements that all housing types be allowed through a clear and objective process and are subject to clear and objective standards. We again made some other updates to ensure that manufactured dwelling parks are consistent with other state statute requirements. So that involves just kind of tweaking definitions, and also I think we've made some updates to allow prefabricated dwellings in manufactured dwelling parks. So again, those are requirements from the state. And again, made some other revisions here to the existing manufactured dwelling placement standards for individual manufactured dwellings allowed on individual lots. So just ensuring that the new standards that apply to those individual manufactured dwellings have clear and objective standards, and that they're no more restrictive than what would apply to single unit detached dwellings on individual lots. And I'll note here, the city didn't already have clear and objective standards that applied to single unit. So we just applied new ones that would apply to specifically to narrow single family units. And the intent there was to ensure that a smaller manufactured dwelling that's allowed on an individual lot kind of fits the design characteristics of existing residential neighbors and neighboring dwellings in existing neighborhoods.
I do want, let me interject here really quick, Brandon, just to let everybody know that there is a bill that's currently going through the state legislature this year that would pretty much strip out cities' abilities for single-family homes and subdivisions and that kind of thing to do design standards. So if that were to pass, then the work that we're doing right now to put in the design standards for this specific application would be removed. So that's one little change just to be aware of.
So why are we doing it?
Because there's no guarantee that that bill will pass, and this is what our project advisory committee and the city council and planning commission to date has identified as us desiring to move forward with. And so until such time as we're told by the state to not move forward with it, I think it's still in the best interest of the community to imply the standards that the community thinks is in its best interest.
Appreciate that. Additional context, Kelly. And yeah, it's still up in the air as to whether that legislation will pass, and if it does, then it definitely is worth revisiting whether these standards should be adopted. So something that should be tracked for sure.
Do you know
Um,
when they're scheduled to vote on that?
All of the bills would need to be finalized and signed by the governor by sometime in end of June.
I guess the best question would be, who's sponsoring the bill?
I can look that up.
And if it's a certain party, then it's probably going to pass.
It is of
Because-
that certain party.
Okay. Because they have a super majority and there's no stopping it, so.
There are modifications that are still being addressed in that bill. So the bill is not finalized, but it is still being debated. But just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention because this was something that was discussed at length. So just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that those are still in flux and that we're still making modifications associated with changes at the state legislature.
Yeah, and for those who are interested, I think the bill is House Bill 2258.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's still going through various work sessions and hearings, and it's still being amended. And I checked yesterday, and plenty of cities are testifying in either opposition or support. So I don't think there's, even if it does pass, there's no guarantee that it would pass in its current form.
No. There's still work
Um,
to be done.
Right. So just to digress back to our recommendations here. So some other updates that we recommended, again, mostly just related to consistency with state statute, updated the definition to manufactured dwellings and dwelling parks, just to basically be the same as the state's definition for these housing types. And this one also came from the housing production strategy. So this was action 1.5, which was really just to allow manufactured home parks outright and remove subjective standards. So that's basically what we've done here with our code update recommendations. It was addressed between two advisory committee memos and meetings. So it was initially addressed in the first round of updates back in the fall, and then we addressed those more specific, clear and objective design standards specifically for the more narrow dwellings back in the second round of updates. So that was part of package one. And that was addressed kind of back in December and January of this last year. So only things that we've changed based on PAC input was I think our initial recommendation was to require design elements for single manufactured dwellings that are less than 18 feet wide, and we bumped that up to 20 feet and applied that to all single unit dwellings so that regardless of whether it's a manufactured dwelling or a single family home, those design standards would apply to just all narrow dwellings on an individual lot. And then we also added an initial recommendation to require a garage, and the PAC suggested that we remove that requirement. So now our recommendation is really just limited to those specific design standards. Other than that, it's all the same content that was provided back in fall and winter. So any questions or comments on this bundle of items.
I do have a quick question on this one, just probably because I don't understand it. On page C32, the very second one up, talks about prefabricated dwellings. And the definition of it, it scratches out mobile home, trailer, recreational, and puts in manufactured dwelling. I guess I get lost in that somehow. Maybe it's because it's the last page and I was googly-eyed, but does that mean that you can't build a manufactured house in a manufactured dwelling spot? And you can't have motorhomes, or you can now?
It's just new terminology. So instead of calling it a manufactured dwelling, it's a manufactured home or prefabricated, is basically
I got you.
the new.
But nothing in this context says I can park a trailer or a mobile home in a, okay. Like I said, I read through it a few times, and I just wanted to make sure.
So the only thing that says is that you can do a manufactured dwelling. It doesn't say. That terminology.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, I think I didn't hear Kelly's response, but it sounds like she
Sorry, I have my
answered the question.
microphone off,
She
so I
covered
don't
me.
cough in the microphone.
She covered
Oh.
me.
Okay, cool.
Like she
All right.
always has to.
If there are no other questions on this item, I'll just keep moving along.
Just a question for clarification.
Oh, sure.
Do the design standards also apply to the manufactured dwelling parks?
No.
No.
So if they put a manufactured dwelling park together, they could put anything they want in.
Yes.
Well, the city, I believe the city already has design standards for manufactured dwelling parks, and we didn't really change those standards, although we did make some minor modifications, I believe, to make sure they're clear and objective. Kelly, you can correct me if I'm off base on any of this.
Yeah, so we have basic design standards within the context of a manufactured dwelling park in terms of the lot sizes required, parking requirements, all of that kind of stuff in terms of, I think we had in there roof pitch requirements and minimum requirements such as that. But the design standards that are proposed for this are when manufactured homes are allowed outside of that park. Because per state law, manufactured homes are allowed to be in any place that a single-family home is allowed to be. And so our previous code specifically said that a manufactured home had to be at least a double wide. State law says that we cannot place that minimum standard because we do not place that minimum standard on a single family home. And so the design standards are put in place to say, well, we don't want to place a minimum standard of a single family home width or a single family home square footage. And so if a single wide manufactured home is going to be placed on a single family lot in the city, then we want to make sure that there are sideboards put in place, which is why the design standards were put in place. But within a manufactured home park itself, we allow them based off of the square footages of lots and meeting the design criteria within that park itself.
So potentially we could put those design standards to a new manufactured home park.
It's not currently written that way.
I guess my concern is if somebody develops a piece of property, develops a manufactured dwelling park, moves in a bunch of old clunkers, there's nothing we could do about it.
So the state law currently only allows, Brandon, you're gonna have to help me the year. But for placement of manufactured homes, it has to meet a certain threshold at this point, and I think it's after 1980s. I think it's
Yeah,
1983, 84.
I think it's actually
Um,
1976, I want to say.
Yeah, 1976.
Yeah.
So-
And so it can't be completely dilapidated. That is still old. But there are those standards and, new ones, you're not going to move those old structures in because once you place them, as you know, Dawn, you're not moving them. So in the creation of a new manufactured home park, you're putting in new homes is the reality of it because you're not moving old homes into it.
Okay.
So, I mean, that logic dictates once you place a manufactured home, it sits there. And so we could, we could put the standard on it, and include it in there and incorporate it. But this standard is only for the narrowed one, the narrow ones anyway, for the single wide. It doesn't apply to the double wide anyway. And so it wouldn't, if you go into most of our, if you go into all of our manufactured home parks, I think most of them are double wide anyway. So the vast majority of the standard wouldn't apply anyway.
All right, any other comments or questions on this? If not,
Nope.
we have a decent amount to keep moving through, so I'll just keep moving forward. So fifth item here is tiny homes. So I don't think we've discussed this, or at least Darcy and I haven't discussed this with the City Council and Planning Commission yet. But this was addressed in the second round of updates. So really, this is just to allow tiny homes as ADUs or in manufactured dwelling parks or in cottage clusters. And we also added a brief little section to the residential additional standards for residential to apply specific development and design standards for tiny homes, and which I'll discuss a little bit more on the next slide. We also added a new definition for tiny homes, and basically using the same definition that I think the Oregon Building Code uses. So this was implementing another housing production strategy action 1.6, which was to allow tiny homes on wheels specifically. And again, this was addressed in the second package, which really was package one, which is the additional proposed amendments, which was from our December memo and our January meeting with the PAC. And based on their input, the only changes we really made were to allow tiny homes on wheels and cottage clusters. That wasn't really our initial recommendation, but that was the recommendation of the advisory committee. And then also added a couple design features, specifically require skirting or around tiny homes on wheels, and require separate utility connections for tiny homes. And before I open it up to questions and comments, just a quick overview on tiny homes, since we haven't really gotten to discuss this with you all yet. So again, this was from the HPS. So overview, the definition would involve tiny homes being a maximum of 400 square feet. Included in the definition is that tiny homes either can be on wheels or they're allowed to be on a permanent foundation, as long as, and if they have wheels, they must provide skirting so they're not visible. Tiny homes must be on a hard, permanent all-weather surface. They must have a pitched roof, just to give it that single-family home feel. And again, allow them as ADUs or in cottage clusters in manufactured dwelling parks. Our recommendation is to require minimum of one off-street parking space per tiny home, unless that tiny home is provided as an ADU. And really, that's because the state prohibits cities from requiring minimum off-street parking for any type of accessory dwelling unit. And that's not to say that a property owner couldn't provide off-street parking if they wanted. It's just that the city can't require off-street parking for ADUs. And then in the definition and some of the standards, we just kind of defer to the Oregon small home construction standards, and just that the city would require all tiny homes be built to the Oregon building code for this type of construction. So any questions or comments on tiny homes?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple comments. The tiny homes, my mom lived in one, and I thought it was kind of cute. I didn't have anything against it. I do have something against tiny homes on wheels. They're just to me, they're just a modified version of a travel trailer. And I think we'd be setting ourselves up for a slum if we start allowing things like that. My neighbor's talking about putting one in his backyard, so he can rent it out, then rent his house out, and then move to Arizona. So those are the kind of scenarios I think we'd want to avoid. But the tiny homes, I think, are cute. I think they're effective, efficient, all that. But the little tiny homes on wheels, I think I think it's just going to change the face of Lebanon and start cramming people into these little travel trailers in people's backyards. You know, I just have a problem with that. Can anybody tell me that I'm wrong?
But they're putting skirting around them and stuff.
Well, yeah,
Making
that
it-
little, see that little tiny home right there, that
It's
looks
adorable.
kind of cool. It's
That's
adorable.
awesome.
My mom lived in one.
Yeah.
But the little tiny homes on wheels are nothing more than a modified travel trailer.
Am I wrong that we
Well-
can't make a separation?
I'm sorry?
Isn't a tiny house, we can't make that distinction? Isn't that what they just said?
Between a travel trailer and a tiny home, there's got to be a distinction of some sort.
I get
not
it.
just the wheel. Yeah, we've got to.
Dave, that one has wheels and it has skirting and it looks okay.
Right, but you know, you take a look at that, that looks great there. I mean, you're being marketed to right there. There's no storage, you know, there's a couple bicycles out there, but you start putting these all over town, and I think it's just gonna turn into a big junkyard. The little tiny homes that are on slabs, they have their own utility hookups, you know, they have their own ingress and egress. But these little tiny homes on wheels, I think could potentially be a big problem. Here's an issue that I have is with these tiny homes is what happens if there's an emergency and the cops or the fire department has to get back there? Are they gonna have to go through somebody else's house, or do they have their own gate? You know, as far as their utility hookups go, are they hardwired in, or the plumbing connected to the house that it's behind, or do they have their own meters? I mean, those are things, you know, that I'm looking at. I just have a problem with these tiny homes on wheels.
So if I may, the tiny homes on wheels, so for full clarification, unlike the previous one where I said the state law would preempt us and not allowing for design standards, that is not subject to tiny homes. So we still have full rights to apply design standards on tiny homes. So we still can do all the design standards in which we have applied. Our design standards, which are established in our code, would require it to look like that, with a roof pitch, with skirting, so that you can't see the trailer, so that you can't see the wheels. It would require it to be on a hard surface pad, and it would require it to be connected to utilities. We allow for accessory dwelling units in our code currently per state law, which is afforded to any property that meets that has a single family home on it. So it's the same exact thing that you were just talking about. The only difference is that it's on wheels versus on a foundation. But the design standards that you're talking about address that. So your same concerns for access exists for accessory dwelling units. Those accessory dwelling units that are stick-built have the same standards in terms of utility hookups as a tiny home on wheels does. The access is the same. The requirements are exactly the same. They have a utility hookup requirement. We do not require accessory dwelling units currently to have their own separate meter. They can connect to the house meter if they wanted to. We are not, they don't have to have their own separate meter if they don't want to. You don't have to have a separate meter if you're going to maintain it as a family unit sort of thing. If you're not planning on renting it out, right? Or if you're just going to incorporate those utilities as part of your home bill. And so the tiny homes on wheels as an accessory dwelling unit is the exact same thing as if it's an accessory dwelling unit in somebody's rear yard. We've applied design standards here to make it look exactly like an accessory dwelling unit in somebody's rear yard. They have the same utility hookup requirements as a regular accessory dwelling unit. And so all of those concerns that you have are addressed in the code.
Yeah, I'm just worried that with these tiny homes on wheels, that it's just gonna, it just starts looking junky after a while. Because they're not, to me, now that little home right there, to me, that's a permanent ADU. The tiny homes on wheels, they just don't seem like a permanent thing to me. They can unhook those utilities and move it around.
But if they unhook those utilities and move it around, they're going to have to rebuild those utilities in the location that they move it to.
And if I might, I think then you also have other avenues to address those issues, specifically code enforcement that can kind of take care of some of that if that does become an issue or if they are violating parts of the code. We do have, enforcement measures in place to be able to combat some of that.
I had a question. It's my understanding when someone buys a manufactured home and they have it moved onto an area, is the code require them to remove the axles and the wheels?
For a manufactured home?
Yes. I've never seen the wheels on a manufactured home after they're in place. They always take them off.
I don't actually know that answer. I'd have
Okay,
to
I'm
get back to you.
pretty.
think that's-
I know that we
I
have,
think they are required to take them off. But if we do the follow-up and see,
I can do
would,
that
would
follow-up.
the, I guess my follow-on question would be, is the tiny homes on wheels fall into that type of category if that is the case?
I would have to do that follow-up for you and see. Tiny homes on wheels are not categorized under the same vehicle code and building code as manufactured homes. They're a different code. So they don't follow those same standards. I can tell you that generically. But I would have to do some additional research to get to that answer for you.
I drove down to Eugene and I went down and I visited one of their parks, drove around it, and I looked at the trailers and stuff that they had in this area. It was looking pretty junky and there was a lot of garbage piled up and stuff like that. And I'm concerned that if, that's my big concern, is that we're just gonna start looking like a slum town after a while. And another big concern is how packed and how dense that we get all these little tiny homes.
So to clarify, accessory dwelling unit, you can have one per single family home dwelling. B, tiny homes on wheels are incorporated within the manufactured home park standards. So we're not creating new standards in which we're creating tiny home villages to where we're creating a whole new subset of a land use. We're just simply saying that those are then allowed within manufactured home parks. much like per state law, recreational vehicles are allowed within manufactured home parks. And so we're just simply saying that those are an additional allotment of a type of unit that's allowed within there. So it's an additional home type that's allowed within there, whether or not it's on a slab or whether or not it's on wheels or not, still has to meet those design standards, still has to be connected to utilities or not.
No,
To answer your trash thing, Eugene has a code standards, we have code standards, we have nuisance standards. And as Brandon said, if those nuisance standards are not being met, then there's the code enforcement avenue. In addition to that, if we are starting to see any of those concerns actually play out, and we do not feel that our code is adequate to address those concerns, the code is an iterative process to where if we feel that some additional standards need to be put in place at that point in time to provide that additional standard for communal trash spaces or something that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head because I'm in a brain fog, but something, we can iteratively change our code at that point in time. But the point of this process is the housing production strategy said that the goal is to allow for these types of uses. Is this initial starting point of ensuring that it's connected to utility hookups, ensuring that it doesn't look like a travel trailer, and ensuring that it's just incorporated into our existing land use and not creating a new opportunity for it on its own, so that we're not creating that situation where Eugene has, where it's its own thing, sufficient as a starting point so that we're not creating that situation to where it's that big concern. This is a toe in the water, not a big splash in the water.
Now, in this packet here, that I printed this off. It's 72 pages. You guys did it with half those because you did the double print. But somewhere in there, and I read it this morning, where these tiny homes on wheels would be allowed on public properties, or church properties, industrial lands. Was that talking about the tiny homes on wheels and the tiny homes? Or was that something else that I read?
You're
That,
gonna have to point out where you,
that should be specific to affordable housing, so not specific to tiny homes or tiny homes on wheels. And we'll get to the affordable housing piece here in a second,
Brandon.
but that's another one that's a state requirement.
right.
So we can
So
talk
the
about
short
that
answer is
next.
no.
So we're not allowed to have them on those types of properties.
No. So what you're talking about, Brandon will clarify in upcoming things. Tiny homes is limited to the areas that I was talking
Yeah.
about.
See, my thing is, I got this package, I've had 5 days to read it, and I got, another life to live. So it's kind of hard for me, I don't know about you guys, it's kind of hard for me to sit down and focus and concentrate on this and get it read and then digest it and then go back and read it again. So I've read this about 3 times, and every time I read it, I read something different.
Mhm.
So,
So this has been, like I said, this has been a year-long process, and I know that you're coming in at the end of the process. And if you have more questions before the hearing process, I'm happy to answer them. This is an overall consensus building exercise of today. And so we're just looking to get the consensus of the whole group of whether or not we're ready to move forward with it. I do understand if you individually have concerns for it. But like I did say, this is an iterative process. If it is something that overall we don't necessarily feel that we've made the mark in a year or two, if something has come up, it is something that we can address in the code and revise. But we do have the housing production strategy that went through, as you were part of, the 1.5-year process of developing that. And I know that you weren't a fan of tiny homes even as that process, but it was a collective group that approved that process through the public hearing process and through the planning commission and the city council. And so now we're moving to this phase where is this code sufficient collectively to the group as a whole? And so that's kind of where we're sitting as a whole.
Well, there's the whole strategy plan. It just seems like there's a lot of stuff in this, a lot of changes to the codes and, a lot of changes to our way of life. Do we have to adopt everything that's in here?
Yes,
Or
sir.
or can we pick and choose, hey, we want this, but we don't want this? Or are we looking at this whole thing going, we have to adopt this whole thing?
That housing production strategy is a game plan that the city has adopted to say, this is what we're committed to do over the next 8 years, to be part of the housing solution as part of the state's goals and mandates.
Now, well, this all started from the housing crisis. So, they came up with this plan to solve the housing crisis. Do we still have the same housing crisis today that we had
Yes, sir,
5 years ago?
if not more.
All right, I'm gonna suggest we keep moving forward because we still have a decent amount to cover here. But as Kelly mentioned, there'll be more opportunities to provide comments on tiny homes as we move through the adoption process. So is that
I thought you died.
Sorry.
right? And that's why the mic was off. Okay. Does that sound all right with everybody? If we keep moving along.
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
All right. So as we mentioned earlier, another key update was zoning for affordable housing, and I think that's what was alluded to as to whether they need to be allowed with on church properties. So this, to summarize, was just to update to ensure that the city allows affordable housing per state rules, specifically consistent with Senate Bill 8, which was passed, I think, in 2021. And in a nutshell, that the city has to allow affordable housing units on church properties or on other properties without having to require a zone change. And this also came from the housing production strategy to update zoning standards to incentivize affordable housing units. So part of achieving that was to update the code to be consistent with state rules for affordable housing, but then also making a few additional updates to allow development bonuses to incentivize affordable housing. So that includes height bonuses and parking reductions, open space reductions, and increased lot coverage. So this was all part of the second round of updates that was included with the tiny homes. So I don't believe this has been addressed fully with this group yet. However, we did talk about it with the project advisory committee. And the only key update that they suggested we change to our recommendation was to be a little bit more nuanced with the parking bonus reduction, which we will talk about here on the next slide. So got a couple slides here on zoning for affordable housing, just to provide a little bit more background again, since this is new information to you all. So these bonuses would only apply to multifamily housing. So as Kelly mentioned, this wouldn't apply to tiny homes, for example. It would allow for a certain density bonus, and that density bonus is outlined in state statute. So we basically just pulled in those thresholds for density bonuses from the state requirements into the city's code. And then same thing with height bonuses. The state does mandate that cities allow certain height bonuses for developments that have a certain percentage of affordable housing. So pulled that into the code as well. Couple that we added was an open space bonus. In other words, to allow a certain reduction of open space requirements for developments that have a certain amount of affordable units. And I think it's important to emphasize here that this wouldn't exempt an affordable housing development from requiring open space. It would just allow us a certain reduction of open space. Similar with lot coverage, this would allow developments to cover more of the property if they have a certain number of affordable units. And then similar with parking, just allowing a certain percentage of parking reduction with a certain percentage of affordable units. So yeah, I'll pause there and see if anybody has questions on the affordable housing piece here.
So I guess I'll ask a question, and I probably should know the answer to this, but what's the criteria for affordable housing?
60% of the median.
80% or below the area median income.
That's for the tenants. I'm talking about the housing. So what,
So there needs to be like an affordability covenant placed on the property to ensure that the housing is provided for the tenants at 80% or below the area median income.
so if it's affordable, that implies we're talking about money. So who sets the rents? Make it
HUD,
affordable.
the Housing and Urban Development at the federal level.
So it's kind of like a Section 8?
Yeah.
Okay.
The equivalency of that, yeah.
So it's,
You don't necessarily need to have Section 8 vouchers, but HUD sets the standard of what is affordable. And you either do it through Section 8 vouchers or through a different program.
okay, so there actually is criteria for the dwelling
Yeah.
unit.
Right. The development standards and design standards be set through the code, and the design standards for multifamily housing would equally apply to affordable housing, if that also helps clarify. Any other questions or comments on this item?
Doesn't look like it.
No.
Not
All
at
right.
this moment.
Keep moving along then. As we have alluded to, this kind of overlaps with a lot of the other items, which is really just to ensure that the code is consistent with state statute. So we addressed several pieces of legislation that have passed over the last few years. Senate Bill 8, which I already mentioned, which was to allow affordable housing under certain conditions. Then there's House Bill 3261, which is to allow conversions of hotels and motels into either affordable housing or emergency housing or shelter. There's also House Bill 3395, which is to allow single room occupancy, or what the city currently refers to as group housing, in all residential zones, and then also allow emergency housing in all zones. And I'll note that the city already does allow group housing in many instances, so this is just kind of loosening any additional restrictions to just be consistent with state statute. And then this last one here, HB 2984, involved updates to ensure that to allow for conversion of existing commercial uses to a residential use, also without a zone change. And that one kind of aligns with the HPS action 1.4, which is to provide more flexibility for housing in commercial zones. And then pretty much all of these, most of them, also align with the other housing production strategy action 2.4, which we addressed on the previous item, which was just to provide more zoning incentives to encourage affordable housing. And then I'll also note it was a priority of this overall code update project to ensure that the all housing related code amendments and sections are consistent with state statute. So this was also addressed in the second round of updates that were covered this last winter, and we didn't really get any specific recommendations from the PAC to make any revisions. They're generally supportive, so everything we are providing here for state statute consistency is the same that we provided originally. So any questions or comments on this piece?
Yeah, Brandon, just a quick one on that HB 3261. Is that kind of what New York did when they put up the immigrants in the hotels and motels? They considered that to be emergency housing and shelter. Is that kind of on the same lines as that?
I'm not really familiar with that case. That said, as far as I know, this would require a hotel or a motel to, still meet the standards that apply to an emergency housing or emergency shelter. So they would have to operate as one. I don't think this necessarily allows an existing hotel to just start operating as an emergency shelter without going through the land use process.
Does that bill also include things like gyms or public places owned by the public?
No, only applies to hotels and motels.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Any
Yeah, kind
other?
of a crazy generic comment here to make that, I hope it doesn't sound crazy. It feels like the state, and this is just a statement, it's not a question. The state has spent a lot more time and wasted a lot more of people's efforts to try to make affordable housing as it has to make it so people don't need affordable housing. Just my opinion.
That's kind of my sentiment too, Dave. I kind of feel like the state of Oregon's coming to Lebanon and telling us how we should run our town or how our people should live or what conditions we should live under. Personally, I kind of resent that.
I just had to say that I know I've been involved in this whole process. I get what's going on, but my overall feeling of it is that.
It's okay.
Okay.
Let's move forward.
All right. All right. So we just got one more key update here to cover. So this last one, this was part of the third round of updates, and this was the one that was mostly focused on consistency and kind of code cleanup updates. And this was really involved a kind of a list of items that the city has been wanting to update for some time now, and they just wanted to address it as a part of this overall project, just for efficiency. And one of those updates that were a part of this list was to update the unit and lot limitations for developments that are have access from access easements or flag lots. So again, this wasn't addressed in the housing production strategy. This was covered in the project advisory committee memo and meeting that was just most recently, that we most recently went over. So yesterday's meeting was the first time that we discussed this with the advisory committee. And as it stands now, this is still an unresolved item. And it's really just kind of up in the air. And I think if I move to the next slide here, we can provide a little bit more context on the overall package 2 amendments. So again, this is various cleanup and consistency amendments. So that included removing existing lot size averaging standards, which kind of aren't necessary anymore, and given the updates to allow for small lot single family. We made some updates to decrease ADU setbacks just to provide more flexibility for ADU siting and development. Reduced zero lot line minimum lot size to 2,500 square feet, and also simplified those standards. And we made that reduction just to be consistent with the new minimum lot size for small lot single family. We made some simplifications and clarifications to the code text for the earned parking reduction section. So not really any substantive updates there. It's just more of cleanup items. We updated the non-conforming use standards just to be consistent with state rules. However, they weren't really substantive changes, also just kind of clarification if I remember correctly. And then we just made a handful of other various amendments throughout the code just to ensure that the updated terminology and updated section numbers are consistent throughout. And yeah, the only thing that kind of remained unresolved on this piece was the number of units that are allowed on access easements and flag lots.
The access easement language that's currently in the code has been pretty much the bane of existence for staff and developers alike. And so it was something that we've been wanting to address since before I got here. And so we're trying to take advantage of the fact that we have our code open and able to be amended right now to address it. And the project advisory committee has a number of developers that use that code regularly on it. So we have gotten direction from the project advisory committee that as long as the amendments to the code do not result in anything more onerous than it currently is, that they would support the amendments that we do. And so we have agreed to move forward with using our development review team process and continuing to talk with those developers as part of that team as sort of like a subset to try to get the code updated before we do the next public hearing process. So what it looks like, we still don't know, but we want to get it fixed.
Yes, thanks for the additional clarification there, Kelly. Yeah, so I don't think there's much else to discuss here, unless anybody has specific questions on this item. If not, we'll just move forward and summarize what we heard from the advisory committee yesterday. All right, hearing none, we'll keep moving along. So as I mentioned, had our advisory committee meeting yesterday morning. And overall, the advisory committee supported all the final code updates and really didn't have many further suggestions or comments. And I think that's mostly thanks to this lengthy iterative process that we've had over the years. So that none of this was new information to them. They've had plenty of opportunities to weigh in and make suggested revisions. So we're we're at the kind of the final stages here, giving people a last chance to weigh in on any of these items. I will note a couple of the items that folks did comment on were pertaining to the package 2 amendments. So that was just the latest round of amendments that they hadn't seen yet. One being that a couple of advisory committee members had discussed potentially reducing the minimum lot size for zero lot line dwellings even further than what we're recommending. And then another point of discussion was mainly around the number of units that are accessed via flag lots and easements. And as Kelly mentioned, the general consensus was just to whatever we come up with or whatever the city comes up with, just ensure it's clear and less restrictive than what currently applies. So additional updates there will be forthcoming, and will be continue to be worked on internally. So with that, I'll just jump to the next steps here. So we'll make some final revisions and ensure that the code amendments are adoption ready. City will need to submit a 35-day notice to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, prior to the first hearing for these code updates. And city will also do their local noticing requirements for these amendments. And we anticipate the adoption hearings to take place over the course of next couple of months, April and May, aiming for adoption in May. So any final thoughts, comments, questions here on the process or any of these key updates?
I would just like to throw out, in coming late to the table, I recognize that it's a little late to be commenting. My sense is that our parking requirements are excessive. We're just adding more impervious surface, and our storm sewers aren't in that greatest shape. And so I would like to see more one parking space per dwelling type setup. And then if the market's demanding 2 parking spaces per dwelling, developers are gonna respond to that. But from a code standard, when I look at these and read these, it feels excessive to me and not as responsive to our long-term needs of a community, allowing kind of the development and market to drive that.
Well, I can speak on that a little bit. We talked about the parking requirements quite a bit, I believe at the last one. And we came to the conclusion that, and I use this example, my 2 sons at one point lived in the apartments over by the hospital area in the college over there. And their parking lot was always full. And then we also talked about affordable housing, that just because someone lives in affordable housing, you'd be surprised how many cars they own. So there was a lot of that discussion back and forth, and no matter what, most families nowadays, or most people nowadays, have more than 1 car. And then you have people that want to come over and visit. And it takes that parking from on the street, so we don't have congested streets, onto an actual parking surface. So that's kind of our thought process behind it. On the market driving, that, once our development happens and we identify later that there's additional parking needing, where do we build it? So there's questions like that. Kelly, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, and I think I can sort of add to it, and I think the consultants can say that parking has been the number one conversation in this whole discussion point. And I think universally the state would like to see all parking requirements go away. But I think that if you look at the developments that have been built in the city, even with the state requirements, for example, with duplexes, right? We are only legally allowed to require 2 parking spaces per duplex. But universally, the market has driven that it's 2 parking spaces per unit, right? So they're providing like a 1-car garage plus a driveway in front. So that's the equivalent of 2 spaces per unit. So the market is already providing more than what the state is saying we're legally allowed to require. And so even though we are going above what the state is legally requiring, our parking codes, the way that we are drafting them, are not onerous in the way that they are. So the way that we're drafting them, it just says 2 spaces per unit. that doesn't mean that it needs to be 2 enclosed parking spaces. So you can still just do 1-car garage plus the driveway space equates to 2 parking spaces. And so even when you're looking at a small lot, single-family home, just by providing a single-car garage, which is what somebody is universally naturally going to provide by minimum, you're already naturally going to be meeting our parking requirements. And so by us providing something that our community is going to feel more comfortable seeing in our code, saying we're addressing a community concern, the developers are already going to naturally be providing anyway. And so until such time as the vehicle pressures of being in a rural community lessen, I think that we can still universally provide what our community is needing without being onerous in the way that our code is designed and meeting that balance. And when it was brought up yesterday, when it was clarified yesterday to the developer who asked a question, does the picture that was shown for the single family lot, small lot, meet our code concept? And we said, yes. She was like, oh, okay, then that's fine. She didn't have a problem with it. So I think we struck that balance, even though it seems like it's onerous, it's not in the way that the code is written. So.
And I imagine there was a lot of discussion, and I just wanted to throw out my opinion. I'm not saying throw out the baby with the bathwater. We'll revisit in 8 years.
Yes.
And maybe in 8 years, so will be the appropriate time.
I will continually say that this is an iterative process.
Yep.
Codes are iterative in nature. They're meant to be relooked at and changed over time.
Yeah, we have to think of things like visitor parking and disabled parking and things like that.
And I apologize, I do have to get to another meeting, so I'm gonna sneak out, but apparently not quietly.
Was there any other questions or comments? Did you have anything else, Kelly?
Thank you all for sitting through this for the last year plus. Thank you for the new ones, for your comments and your interest in it. It has been a long road, and our next step, unless there's any major heartburn, is to finalize the code and propose it for adoption.
Kelly, could I just mention in the packet on page 4, there are also some fairly modest recommended changes to policy, and those are really made to support the changes that you've heard today, the packet that's going forward for the code. So just to point that out, if you go forward with those policy amendments, you'll actually be updating your comprehensive plan as well as your development regulations. Just point that out. And again, if there's any questions, I'm sure we'll be happy to help Kelly answer those prior to your first evidentiary hearing.
Yeah, really quickly, just to put some ease on the policy amendments, there are 5 proposed. 4 of them are to modify the language to meet the state change of prefabricated housing definition. And then the 5th one is just to identify the efficient land use pattern to support the small lot, single family home concept for infill development and that kind of thing. So
That's outrageous.
yeah. So they're very simple policy changes. We're not talking about a wholesale change of what Lebanon looks like.
Yeah,
That's my
appreciate that. Yeah, I think we also covered this in some previous meetings as well. Just
Yes.
since they are pretty modest and really just intended to ensure consistency between comp plan and code, figured it wasn't worth spending too much time here. But yeah, it's important to note nonetheless.
Yes. And we're good.
Okay, so I'll just close out. I'd like to thank Brandon and Darcy for their time on this matter and also the presentation that you just provided. Darcy, I'm glad you got to speak. We didn't hear you the whole time, and you got in at the end there, so I appreciate that.
I always have lots to say. Editing is my problem, so I keep it short.
All righty, if there's no other questions or comments of staff or this process, this meeting is adjourned.